welcome back to more Warhammer lore. In today's video we'll be delving into the Dwarven Ancestor Gods, as well as how they relate to dwarf history and possible speculations as to what they actually are, or were. As usual, all of the information for this video will be taken from the latest army books, quite a bit from the Warhammer Fantasy novels, and the majority of this information will be coming from the Warhammer Fantasy roleplay expansions specifically. And with that out of the way, let's get into the lore proper, starting with what the Ancestor Gods are. So, the dwarfs in Warhammer have a very unique kind of religion. It is heavily based on Norse mythology, and is almost one of a kind in the Warhammer world. Sort of. You see through several hints and at least one confirmation, the Ancestor Gods were actually people, well, dwarves, to be specific. One could assume probably amongst the first that were elevated by the Old Ones all those thousands of years ago. We know this because Malaya was actually found to be a living being in the End Times novels, which by proxy makes the idea that all of the other gods were once people all the more apparent. Now, we will be discussing these gods in more detail soon, but I want to establish the idea that the ancestor worship and how it fundamentally changes a religion from what we would usually believe it to be is very unique for the Dwarven pantheon. As a species, the dwarves value tradition above all things, and early on in their uplifting, one of their number came across the idea for worshipping their founders as opposed to some mythical deity. This goes hand in hand with the dwarves' distrust of magic and the lack of magical aptitude amongst their own kind. You see, unlike the elves, whom created their gods and through magical rituals were able to summon them to manipulate their good fortune and whatnot, the dwarves despise magic, and so it would make sense that through this distrust they would shun the very idea of creating some foreign deity to rule over them. But this is where it starts to get a little tricky, as the Ancestor Gods were actually still alive at the time that they were being worshipped. They had not yet been interred in their long-lost tombs, and were literally the heroes and visionaries of the first recorded dwarves. Now, the way magic works in Warhammer, and specifically chaos influence, which is what magic is that if you devote enough belief and pour enough emotion into an idea or cause, it will literally take shape in the realms of chaos and then spread its influence into the physical world. This is how the Dark Gods came into being, as they are each representatives of fundamental emotions of nearly all races and are primal in nature, which makes them so powerful, as they technically are worshipped by every living being in the Warhammer world, even those actually opposed to their cause. I'm starting to get a little sidetracked here, but back to the Ancestor Gods. The problem with them being still alive and being worshipped is that we can't cultivate the idea that they were somehow manifested in the realms of chaos and then brought forth to lead the dwarfs, kind of like what the elves were doing. These beings were already here, living amongst their people, which does not mean that they did not have godlike qualities. And the reason I say this is that we can make the idea of the Ancestor Gods and all of their great deeds they accomplished to make the most sense is to divert our thoughts away from the normal, I know that's kind of an odd term to use, but the normal supernatural occurrences in Warhammer, and look back once again to the Old Ones and their influence specifically. The Old Ones are the creators of the modern Warhammer universe, and they were extremely technologically advanced and used their knowledge to uplift several species around the Warhammer world. Their mastery can still be seen through the massive temple cities still inhabited by the lizardmen, and most of all the floating island of Ulthuan, which not only survived the great collapse of the polar gates, but also several demonic incursions in almost the end times. Almost. The point is, their mastery was literally on par with that of a god in Warhammer. So when the Old Ones uplifted these dwarves as one of their chosen species, It only makes sense that they would impart upon them knowledge to help guide and benefit them as a whole. And I believe that the way they did this was through the Ancestor Gods, as conduits, essentially, which they seem to have subtly influenced, possibly through dreams or other methods, to imbue these beings with godlike qualities, ranging from innate knowledge of rock and ore, which no one even knew existed at the time, to engineering and industry on a scale not seen before, to harnessing magic in a way that was unfathomed at the time. The range and talents of the Ancestor Gods are very interesting and unique, especially for a Warhammer pantheon. And this still does not discredit the idea that the Ancestor Gods were actually imbued with their abilities from the sheer worship of them. I'm just saying that they might have gotten a little nudge in the right direction from the old ones. Now, technically, the way this could work, also, another theory, is that the dwarves' worship of the Ancestor Gods literally created something similar to the Ancestor Gods in the realms of chaos, where their heaven and hell would be, technically. Well, in this case, the hall of their ancestors, and then the in-between for them. And in this realm, it's possible that their beliefs and their trust actually brought forth mystical energies to imbue the Ancestor Gods with their abilities as well. That's also a viable option, a viable speculation. We'll never really know the answer because we never got a straight answer from Games Workshop. So we'll never really know, so there's tons of different speculation, but you're not here to listen to me speculate. So let's actually get into the pantheon of the Ancestor Gods, which we'll start with the most important deity in their pantheon being the Patriarch Grungy. And I will probably mispronounce several of these names as my Norse is not very not very good, or in this case I guess I should call it Khazlid, the language of dwarfs. So Grungy is the ancestor god of mining, metalworking, and stonework, and would be considered the chief deity of the dwarfs. He is depicted as a stalwart dwarf with a long forked iron beard that dangles almost about his ankles. His body is completely draped in chainmail. He is typically depicted carrying a miner's pickaxe, but can also be seen wielding a runic warhammer in his more warlike aspect, named Drangundrun, or the Thunderhammer. Now, Grungy is said to have discovered the ways of mining ore and metal, and was chiefly responsible for passing this down to the dwarfs, making him the most important singular ancestor god in their society, which is typically based around mining. I mean, they are dwarves after all. Stonework and, of course, metal crafting. It is also said that back in his time, he was the one that took his people from the surface and took them deep into the earth, which shielded them from the collapse of the Chaos Warp Gates during the Great Catastrophe, which he had actually prophesied in a dream, possibly at the behest of the Old Ones. This kept the majority of his people safe, as we know the Dawizar didn't quite make it to shelter. From here, he also was responsible for rallying his people and leading armies to push back the forces of chaos that had invaded the old world, and he was instrumental in cleansing the land of their kind. He also appears to have some skill with crafting, as it is claimed that he created many powerful artifacts, one actually being the Throne of Power, which every High King sits on to this day, a weapon of great destruction and also inspiration to the Dawi. Now, every god has a symbol or rune associated with them, and Grungy's looks like a pick, or sometimes a stylized version of his forked beard. Now, in this way, it is easy to find a temple of Grungy and pick out his priests. Now, I would like to believe he was taught directly by the Old Ones, and was used as almost a conduit for their influence into Dwarven society. Perhaps maybe he was the strongest vessel at the time, and therefore it became apparent that he would be the most powerful of the ancestor gods to his people. That's all speculation, of course, but still, moving on. Which brings us to the next god in the pantheon, Grenier, the god of warriors, and particularly slayers. Now, I will be doing an entire video devoted to the Slayer cult, so I will keep my description brief on him for the sake of time. Grenier was the protector of his people and responsible for showing them the ways of battle, of actually hand-to-hand combat. That was his specialty. In his day, he repelled everything from giants to dragons, and eventually the forces of chaos. He is depicted as a stout, heavily built dwarf, very, very muscular, and he dual wields 2 sacred axes which were forged by him by Grungy, who is his brother. So he is the brother of Grungy. He also has a long, straight mohawk, really tall, spiked with animal fat, and dyed a crimson red, as well as an equally impressive and dyed beard. And we're talking about like a deep red, like almost blood red. Of course, he also does not wear any armor, instead going into battle bare-chested, covered in elaborate blue tattooing, which incorporates his symbol of his dual-headed axes. Of course, there is much more on Grenier, but I am saving that for a later video. So let's move on to our next god in Malaya, the only female god in the pantheon. Malaya is the goddess of hearth and home, as well as brewing, a very important part of Dwarf Society, and the goddess of healing. She's said to have personally founded countless holds, including the Great Karak and Karak 8 Peaks. She is also the wife of both Grungy and his brother Grenier. And yes, you did hear me right. Now, I'm not sure who she married first, or maybe it's insinuated that she was married to both of them at the same time. It's not definite, but she had children from both men, seemingly around the same time. I'm not sure how long these dwarfs lived. I would assume they were more long-lived than the average of their kind. So, it's hard to explain, but she was married to both brothers, which is super awkward and weird, but it's Warhammer. So, Malaya is depicted as a dwarf woman, which in Warhammer, they don't have beards, so they're kind of just normal dwarven women, I guess you would call that. They have a stoutness about them, almost like the men. But she specifically is depicted with 2 long braids of hair that curl down to her feet, almost as long as any of the dwarfs' beards. But she tends to wear a set of chainmail over a purple robe, and she wields a rune axe named Kradonsky. I can't pronounce it, guys. It's known as the Peace Giver in normal English. So there are several different runes associated with Malaya, but her followers are easily found as they are the only form of clergy that is completely made up of women, or Rins as they are called in Dwarven Society. Their chief task involves healing, and interestingly enough, the sanctification and protection of the dwarven holds. You see, in addition to inventing brewing and therefore dwarf's beer, Malaya was also the goddess who developed a rune that actually protects the holds and those bearing this rune from the effects of chaos, and can actually be used to weaken the effects of chaotic influence, and therefore magic, even to the point of nullifying it completely. There are examples of even greater demons of chaos being felled by these sanctified blades, and unable to stand the presence of her representation. Malaya is also the reason that we know that the Ancestor Gods were actually once physical beings, as she makes a somewhat limited but impactful appearance in the end times. Now, as far as being the only female dwarf, the reason behind that is that Dwarven Society is made up, they don't give a specific number, but it is primarily made up of men, meaning that in a ratio of men to women, I would say you probably get 10 dwarfs, men, to every 1 Rin. So female dwarves are a commodity almost, because that's how your species propagates, because they do propagate the old-fashioned way. And so they are protected in a way, which makes sense that they would develop this culture around them of them staying at home, doing the brewing, doing the cooking, because they need to be protected. They don't need to be fighting in a battlefield, because if you lost all your women, the clan would collapse and there'd be nothing left. So we'll get more into this in the society video, but for now, that's mostly the reason why we only see one ancestor goddess in the pantheon, but that is my conclusion, at least. The next ancestor god may actually be the most important, second only to Grungy himself. Of course, I'm talking about Gazul, the god of the Under-Earth and protector of the dead. Now, you can think of him similar to Mor, the human god of the underworld, and that while most underworld deities are seen as malicious, Gazul is seen as more of a shepherd and a wrathful god for those who would dare spoil the fallen dead, making him and his followers direct enemies of necromancers and just undead kind. In addition to protecting the dead, Gazul was also the dwarf responsible for venerating the ancestor gods, meaning he actually taught his fellow dwarfs to worship their ancestors, which did include himself, but mostly the worship of Grungy, Grenier, and Malaya, and subsequently their children. So in a nutshell, he is responsible for founding the Dwarven religion as we know it in Warhammer today. Definitely a very important figure, to say the least. He also was the one that discovered, or probably was led to discover, of the various runes associated with each ancestor god, which gave them power over the elements, and technically magic in a way. Gazul is depicted as a kind of gloomy dwarf with jet black hair and streaks of gray. He wears a suit of black iron under a black coat and carries a rune sword called Zarvengrin, or the Flaming Vengeance. I'll let you guess what kind of properties it has. But his choice of weapon is very unique amongst his kind, as dwarfs typically don't actually wield swords. They prefer hammers and axes, though it is not unheard of to wield a sword, but certainly not a spear. I'm getting a little off topic here, but yeah. His worship has actually inspired a kind of dwarven witch hunters garbed in black and red trim, much in the same way as witch hunters of the Empire, which might be where these hunters got their idea of their color scheme. The hunters of Gazul, however, specifically specialize in banishing undead and rooting out undead influence in the holds and in the nearby lands that might threaten the holds. So they have a very specific task, as opposed to the Empire's witch hunters, which kind of cover all freakish entities, including chaos entities as well as undead. So there is that. The next god is that of Smednir, which oddly enough is the god of metalworking and refining ore. Now you might be thinking at this point, why is there more than one god for metalworking in this pantheon? And that is simply that metalworking is a very important aspect of Dwarven culture. And much like how they are multiple gods of war in other mythical pantheons, there are multiple gods of crafting and such in the Dwarven pantheon. However, Smednir is actually seen as the chief deity when it comes to this, as he is the oldest son of Grungy and Malaya, and he was said to have forged the most powerful weapons of the dwarf holds that they actually wield to this day, with the help of his younger brother, of course, Thungni, that's how you say it. Supposedly all of the ancient relic weapons of the current dwarf kings was forged by this pair, which includes the mighty Galmaraz, the hammer wielded by Sigmar Heldenhammer, which was when he was a man, and the symbol for his worship to this day, which also kind of ties in the deep bond between man and dwarf, as their religions literally are intertwined in a way and venerated much in the same. Smednir is usually depicted as a bare-armed, heavily muscled dwarf wearing a blacksmith's apron. His beard is braided into one long singular braid and thrown over his shoulder by the power of his forge. He is usually seen wielding a rune hammer, Azul Kurid, or also known as the Metal Crafter, being in line with his specialty. Which moves us straight into Smednir's younger brother, Thungni, the god of runic magic and rune smithing. Grungy was said to have ventured deep into the earth and discovered a place he called the Encorbirn, or Glittering Realm. More than likely, what he actually stumbled into was probably a small rift in reality in the actual planes of chaos, where magic does in fact come from. When he emerged, he was instilled with the knowledge of rune magic and the craft of forging symbols that could bend the winds of magic to be harnessed by the dwarfs, which normally, giving their magic-resistant nature, would be all but impossible. He found that only certain dwarfs were capable of this feat, being himself, his father, Grungy, and a few of his descendants, as the forging of a rune is taxing and dangerous to a dwarf without the natural inclination for such, and most of them would have died in the attempt. Rune magic is ridiculously powerful, and the weapons created during this time are some of the most potent relics to this day still wielded in battle. But of course, rune magic can be used for many other things, and I think it probably does deserve its own video at some point, so I'll make a mental note of that, and we will do that as well. Now, Grungy is depicted as a dwarf with reddish brown hair covered in plate armor, inscribed with his own personal rune. In one hand he wields a runic staff, and the other his rune hammer, Kazakh rune, or the Ending War rune is what it's called. His followers are nearly as easy to pick out as those of Malaya's, as they are the runesmiths and the rune lords of the Dwarven holds, and they're actually quite few these days, as the runecraft is slowly being lost with each passing generation, as the winds of magic have died down over time. That is, up until the inevitable end times when there was an explosion and the world ended. That makes me sad. Well, let's move on to the last of the Ancestor Gods that we know enough about to be included, and that is Morgrim, whom is the eldest son of Grenier and Malaya. He is the god of engineering and the god responsible for teaching the dwarves how to build weapons of war. In fact, he developed the first stone throwers and bolt throwers, as well as numerous traps that were used as a first line of defense against the forces of chaos after the collapse, and against all those enemies that have opposed his people up to this point. His association with his father Grenier also brought him deep into the Chaos Wastes, where we last saw the god of war, from which Morgrim reluctantly returned back to his people and ultimately joined him and his fellow ancestor gods below the earth, where they were last seen by any mortal. Morgrim is usually depicted wearing a full set of mail, with a belt full of tools of the engineering trade. His hair and skin is covered in dust, and his hands with oil. He wields one of his father's axes, Grungy, or also known as the Widowmaker. His symbol is a stylized stone thrower, and his followers are the creators and engineers of the dwarf holds. A very robust and very much needed caste that keeps the dwarf holds running and allows the stalwart individuals to defend what little they have, at least are capable of, in their diminished state against the overwhelming odds of their numerous enemies. And that about wraps up the Dwarven Pantheon, or at least the most important members of the Ancestor Gods. There is mention of some lesser gods, but there's basically little to no information on them. And technically, any long-dead ancestor at this point in Warhammer could become an Ancestor God. A lesser god, but technically still a god in their culture. One example, or should I say suspected example, is Grombendrall, the White Dwarf, whom is suspected to be the long-dead Snorri Whitebeard, the former High King that reigned during the time of first contact with the elves of Ulthuan and their ambassador, Malekith. Needless to say, certain oaths were broken, by whom is now the leader of the Druchii, or Dark Elves, and some speculate that Snorri was resurrected as Grombendrall, as a now living ancestor god that takes out his vengeance upon all those that would harm his people. Which I do admit does fit the theme of ancestor worship and the ridiculous degree to which oaths and grudges influence dwarven culture, so it is a viable theory. but it was never officially confirmed, and so we sadly will never know. Oh, and on that note, there's one other deity I forgot to mention, and that was Hashut, whom is the chief deity of the Dawizar, or the Chaos Dwarves. Now, there is no official documentation that Hashut was an ancestor god, and in fact, if you've seen my Hashut video, you will know that I think that he is a different kind of deity entirely. So for more information on that, you should check that one out. But there are still some theories that Hashut was something akin to the devil in the Dwarven pantheon, so I thought it would be worth mentioning, at least. And his name does come up in the novels, especially, often as a kind of slur by the Dawi when talking about terrible things or some great disgrace that has befallen some people. And with that, I am ending this lore video on the Ancestor Gods pantheon of the mighty Dawi. They are an interesting lot, to say the least, with a very uniquely Warhammer twist over the typical Norse roots. If you have any questions about the content discussed today, feel free to leave it down in the comment section and I will answer it to the best of my abilities. As usual, guys, I would like to say thank you all for watching this lore video, and on a personal note, I am thankful for all the support to keep these lore videos going. I don't have as much time as I used to between work and my now growing family, but I will do my best to keep these coming as long as you guys are watching. Now, if you are new to the channel, I do ask that you like this video, and feel free to subscribe to the channel, as it will keep you up to date with all the lore I can possibly put out, as well as helps the channel grow and to be noticed by more and more people, therefore propagating this endless cycle. And I am literally shocked at how many of you there are at this point, and I can't say thank you enough for all the support, guys. As usual, I have been Jumbo Thick. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you all very soon. Have a good day.